Again this afternoon, I want to welcome everybody to another edition of the Corby Connections. Our host today, our guest today is Clayton Trutor.
Yes.
He's a historian, an author, and a freelance writer. He teaches history currently at Norwich University in Vermont. He writes about sports, public policy, popular culture, and a wide range of national and regional publications. His first book was Loserville, How Professional Sports Remade Atlanta, and How Atlanta Remade Professional Sports. It was received and starred review from Publishers Weekly. He's also been featured in ESPN and Sports Illustrated. Today he's going to talk about Marchy Schwartz. I hope I got that right. And the Four Horsemen. So I'll turn it over to Pat and let Pat take it from here.
Thank you, Mike and Clayton. We're so thrilled to have you as a guest on this series of interviews that we do. I've reviewed all of the writing that you've done on a variety of topics, and especially a lot of sports figures and how that fits into the history of what was going on in the world at the time. And of course, we're all biased at the University of Notre Dame's Alumni Club in Gettysburg. So I'm focusing on a couple of your articles that you wrote from the Knute Rockne Four Horsemen era. And everybody who's a college football fan has, probably has heard of Knute Rockne and the Four Horsemen. The Four Horsemen were Stoulger, Miller, Crowley, Layden. Of course, the only surviving of the Four Horsemen is our club president, Mike Miller, and what a player he was. But people have heard of them. But there's another player that you've written about who flies under the radar despite some amazing accomplishments on the football field as a Notre Dame football player. Tell us about Marchy Schwartz.
Well, first of all, Mike, Pat, thanks for having me on. It's a genuine pleasure to speak with the Notre Dame Club of Gettysburg. Marchy Schwartz was a running back in the late 1920s and early 1930s. He was the first Jewish All-American football player from Notre Dame. He was an All-American, consensus All-American in both 1930 and in 1931. He was a member of both the 1929 and the 1930 national championship teams. He grew up in and around New Orleans, initially played at Loyola University in New Orleans for Clark Shaughnessy, who created the T formation. Rockne came across him, saw he could certainly help the Notre Dame team. Rockne had recruited a number of Jewish players prior to this. Probably most notably, Norm Hewitt was a very good offensive lineman during the 1920s in the Horseman era. Earliest Nate Silver was a quarterback at the turn of the century for Notre Dame. So Notre Dame had Jewish players all along. And recruited Schwartz to come to South Bend, and he certainly excelled for the Fighting Irish in the box offense. It's interesting. He's a guy who played for two different major offensive innovators in Shaughnessy at Loyola, who goes on to bring the T to the NFL eventually, as well as with Rockne with the box offense, relying on the speed and quickness of Notre Dame. And Schwartz was perfectly suited to this style of play, becoming one of the offensive stars as a junior in 1930. I first came across his story when reading about the 1930 Notre Dame Army game at Soldier Field, which drew 110,000 people. Schwartz scores the game-winning touchdown in that game, a 7-6 Notre Dame victory, and is a part of that national title team. He carries on into 1931, really carries the flag for the team after the death of Rockne, with the coaching change to Hunk Anderson, with the loss of so many of those stars from the 29 and 30 national title teams. Notre Dame isn't quite at the same level in 1931. They have a 6-2-1 season, but Schwartz continues to compile yards, and by the end of his career, he's the #2 leading rusher in Notre Dame history behind George Gipp. The purpose of the article, as much as anything, was to reintroduce this figure who's been somewhat forgotten, and also to talk about his legacy as having been a great Jewish player at a Catholic institution. I think one thing that's often underestimated about Notre Dame is what an inclusive place it has been for such a long time, brought so many people together without a lot of fanfare, really. and Notre Dame's commitment to having a broad umbrella and incorporating a lot of people is seen through the story of Schwartz. Rockne was certainly open to anybody who could help the football team out, and was actually a great supporter of Jewish causes on a number of occasions. When Notre Dame played in Chicago, a range of charities benefited from those games, and Jewish charities frequently were among the beneficiaries of Notre Dame's gate in Chicago. So I wanted to bring that story to light through telling the story of Marchy Schwartz.
Yeah, and before reading your article, I didn't realize that Knute Rockne himself had a commitment to helping Jewish charities. He was earmarking a portion of gate receipts to go to Jewish charities. He was actively recruiting players who were Jewish, and you have to, as you as a historian can sort of put this in the context of the time. I mean, if we're talking the late 20s, the 30s, I mean, so meanwhile, this is before World War II, but Nazism is on the rise. Eventually, we would have Hitler to deal with. And here's Notre Dame, probably accustomed to facing its own discrimination against Catholics, and they're actively including Jewish charities and Jewish players. And that just seems, was that something that got a lot of fanfare at the time that Notre Dame was doing this?
Well, from the Notre Dame perspective, they didn't even really think it was a big issue. Notre Dame didn't promote this at all. If you look at sports writers, they were always making these weird oblique references to it. Like they talked about the number of the tribes of Israel on their team, or the Hebrew, all these just bizarre things they said about Marchy Schwartz in the time period, these kind of euphemisms they used to describe him as being Jewish. Actually, searching out stories about him was kind of odd, because I would often look up, Jewish Notre Dame in that era kind of thing, and wasn't finding a lot of stuff. But oftentimes sports writers were referring to him as a Hebrew, like he lived 5,000 years ago or something. It's very odd the way he was talked about. And both Catholics and Jews facing discrimination in that era certainly was a major thing. One of the things I find most remarkable about Notre Dame's success in the 1920s is being in the state of Indiana, a state that had a member of the KKK as its governor at one point in the 1920s. So Notre Dame did not shy away from incorporating a lot of different people who were facing discrimination in this era. In terms of Rockne being a guy who grew up in Chicago, he was used to living in a very diverse polyglot place. He dealt with people from all over the world all the time growing up. And he certainly showed that in his approach to the game. He was willing to bring a wide range of people into Notre Dame and make it their home. He himself is somebody who comes in as a Norwegian, as a Lutheran, is an outsider, and ends up making Notre Dame his home too. So I think it again speaks to the success of Notre Dame at building this inclusive place during this era.
I think even if you fast forward to more modern times, I know that in the early 1990s, Coach Lou Holtz was it wasn't really a big deal on the Notre Dame campus. It probably something that Lou Holtz did not consider it a big deal, but he was recruiting a very highly regarded quarterback out of New York by the name of Gus Ornstein, who was Jewish. And of course, it was the press who made a big deal out of this. And it's hard to know whether they consider this Catholic university to be peculiar, and why would it be even more peculiar for a Jewish quarterback to go there? But in his own way, his own unique and wonderful way, Lou Holtz just simply quipped back to them when they asked about the significance of a Jewish quarterback coming to Notre Dame. He just pointed to the Golden Dome and said, "You see that lady on top of the dome? She's 100% Jewish." And that's Lou Holtz for you. But I think that tells you that there's something that the popular press has picked up on, in a way that Notre Dame just sort of assumes that this inclusivity and breaking down these barriers is just what they do. That's what Notre Dame is about.
Absolutely. I mean, when Gus Ornstein's being recruited and he ends up at Notre Dame, that's an interesting time, because you would see Marchy Schwartz's name starting to appear in stories. Until about 1970 or so, anytime there would be an article, some sports writer kind of riffing on the idea of the great Jewish athletes of all time, Marchy Schwartz's name would often be in there until about 1970. But when that generation of sports writers who'd come of age in the 1920s ceased to be the people writing most of the articles, his name became less and less common. But in the 90s, you see Marchy Schwartz's name come up a little bit again when he's there as the backup quarterback for Ron Powlus. So yeah, it is odd the way things come up again like that.
But returning to Marchy Schwartz himself, I mean, it is odd that he's only gotten this occasional reference, usually in the context of other people. But you pointed out he was He had rushing records. He averaged, you say in your article, he was averaging 7.5 yards per carry, a game-winning touchdown against Army that you already alluded to. The guy was 5'11", 170 pounds, and so not some sort of a beast, and yet he was sort of agile, and he was that seemed to be his trademark.
And it's interesting the way he evolved too, because he goes from being a part-time kind of flash early on in his career to being the guy who is completely bearing the burden by the time he's a senior. As I was researching this, I thought a lot about the 1967 Notre Dame team after the championship team in '66. They have a little bit of a fallback. They lose 2 early games. You have Rocky Bleier, who's sort of in a similar position, being the guy who bears the load for that team. He's not going to win any championship, but they go on and win 4 or 5 games in a row down the stretch, showing their pride, showing their commitment to the institution. And you have this senior leader who's in some ways, a generation or two later, playing the same role Marchy Schwartz did in the 1931 season. I think a little bit about 1991 as well, after '88, and then the close call in '89, and then in 1990, they're right there as well. They're a little bit off the pace in '91, but then they have that Sugar Bowl showing where they upset that Florida team. I think it's a recurring story in the history of Notre Dame. These people who maybe Notre Dame is not at a championship level in a particular season, but the senior leaders often rise to the occasion and lead to some surprising results.
Right, and speaking of 1991, that was the year that Marchy Schwartz ended up passing away in California, but not after, or not before. He coached for 5 years, the head coach at Creighton, 8 years at Stanford. But he ended up having a big family, and I believe he even converted to Catholicism before his death.
Yes, his wife was Catholic, and he ended up converting. He lived in the Bay Area. He was an executive with Transamerica Insurance. Had a very successful, really quiet life after he got out of football. I mean, early on, he went right into coaching. I think it proved to be very stressful. I mean, he's coaching in the precursor to the Pac-10 at Stanford. He's following up his one of his mentors, in Clark Shaughnessy, who was very successful at Stanford. So he was in a very difficult position, and I think he just chose to have a very standard, normal life and helped raise a family, and was very successful after his days in football. That may play some role in his muted, I guess, legacy as well, that he stepped away from the game, by about 1950 or so, and for the next 4 decades, just as a private citizen. Certainly Notre Dame alumni remembered him for many years, but he's not a guy who remained in the public eye as many of the other Notre Dame stars did. I also think coming before the Heisman Trophy era was part of it too, because all of those guys who won the Heisman Trophy, just by whether it's Leon Hart or Lou Jack or whomever, that gave them a sense of immortality by being associated with that trophy in a way guys before that who weren't among the Horsemen, who weren't Gipp, who weren't Rockne, anybody else, it was very hard to have that sense of being a permanent part of the story of college football, even if they get inducted into the Hall of Fame like Schwartz does in 1974.
Right. Well, returning then to the days when he was playing, we've already mentioned, I mean, Knute Rockne is part of the Marchy Schwartz story. The Four Horsemen were there at that time, and we generally know people watching this will have some familiarity with them. What they might not know about, I certainly did not, was that Rockne and at least some of the Four Horsemen took on an NFL team back in 1930. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely, yes. After the 1930 season, you're in the middle of the Great Depression. Notre Dame has just won its 2nd consecutive national title. Notre Dame has a strong association with New York City today. Long in the past, it certainly did too, playing frequently at Yankee Stadium. They had a strong connection with the Maras, who were strong Notre Dame supporters, who owned the New York Giants. The Giants invited Notre Dame to build an all-star team after the 1930 season, a team that included the Four Horsemen, a team that was coached by Rockne, a team that included some of the other recent graduates and stars. And that team, it doesn't include Marchy Schwartz because he's still got another year of eligibility, but it's all of the greats of the 1920s basically get together after a couple of practices and take on the New York Giants, who just finished a season where they finished 2nd in the NFL. And Notre Dame's just treating this as an exhibition. Let's raise some money for people in New York who are in need. Over 50,000 people turn out, largely cheering for Notre Dame against the hometown Giants at Yankee Stadium. And the Giants take it immensely more seriously. The NFL is not certainly in the place then that it is now as being really the premier sports attraction. College football was immensely more popular. The Giants, despite being a highly successful NFL team, were struggling to survive. The Giants viewed this game as essentially a referendum on their team's significance. And Notre Dame was the most popular team in New York City, not the Giants. So the Giants go out and cream this Notre Dame team that is really ill prepared to play. Some of these guys have not played in several years. And at halftime, Rocky's like, what are you guys doing? We came here to raise some money, have some fun. You're treating this like it's the Battle of the Bulge, which I guess hadn't happened yet. But they're treating it like this, major military engagement kind of thing. And essentially, it's a story of this very unique game, which proved to be the last time Rockne coached the Notre Dame team, the last time the Four Horsemen suited up for Notre Dame too. It's in some ways kind of an ignominious end, but at the same time, I think it's remarkable. It was this opportunity for people in New York to honor the Notre Dame team again. They had a great turnout. They raised a lot of money for the mayor's Depression era relief fund. So in many ways, it was a positive experience. And I think in some ways reflects very poorly on the Giants organization that they took this thing so incredibly seriously that was just an exhibition.
It does, but it's just shocking knowing how much money is in professional football now. Of course, that's true of college football compared to that time as well. But when you said that the hometown New York crowd showed up for Notre Dame and not quite as much for their hometown NFL team, we actually know that to be true to some extent, because I read in your article that 50,000 people showed up for the game. Well, the Giants, who had some of the biggest gate receipts in the NFL at the time, had only had 82,000 total in all of their previous home games that season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the NFL is really small potatoes in this time period. If anybody's interested in the early history of the league, there's a man named John Eisenberg, who's a great sports writer from Baltimore, who wrote a book called The League, which is essentially a history of the NFL from its founding in 1920 until Rozelle takes over as commissioner in 1960. And it really gives you a sense of just how small in the sporting food, or how low in the sporting food chain NFL was relative to like 10 other activities at the time. And these guys really had to struggle and pinch pennies to remain in business. I mean, college football, whether it was Notre Dame or Michigan or Southern Cal or whomever, Army was a much bigger deal than pro football in this time period, a much larger gate attraction. Anywhere you went, really. I can't think of any particular place where pro football was a better attraction. Even historic NFL towns, New York, Philly, Pittsburgh, college football was really the attraction in this era, and there was no greater attraction than Notre Dame. I mean, by the end of the 1920s, Notre Dame is a national phenomenon with fans in every state. I mean, I think of growing up as a Notre Dame fan decades later. I know my grandfather was cheering for Notre Dame in the 1920s. I'm a little boy. 1988 is the first season I remember. I was 7 years old at the time, getting to stay up late to watch the Notre Dame Michigan game, the first game of the year. My mom's like, "This is your team. This is who we're going to cheer for." And I got to stay up late, so it was fantastic. And watching Ricky Waters run back that punt and Reggie Ho kick all those field goals, I was hooked on Notre Dame from that moment onward. So it just built up this multi-generation thing of people who have no connection to the institution whatsoever. I mean, my family grew up in Vermont. I don't think any of them had ever been to Indiana before. But this was their team forever.
Well, you've given us a window into some specific people and the context of what was going on in the world, and how Notre Dame was doing its thing with the inclusivity of people of the Jewish faith, even when across the world, that was a very big deal at the time. You've given us a sense of college football versus the NFL. This is just really interesting history, and I want to thank you for sharing your time with the Notre Dame Club of Gettysburg.
It's a genuine pleasure. There are very few things closer to my heart. Very few things closer to my heart than either Notre Dame or Gettysburg. I grew up a Notre Dame fan. I think I've missed 2 games since 1988. The 89 SMU game wasn't on local TV around here. And then one time I was at a conference, and they were playing Air Force like probably 7 or 8 years ago, and it was on CBS Sports or something. They didn't get it at the hotel, so I missed that game too. But I think those are the only 2 times I've missed Notre Dame games since 1988. And Gettysburg, which I mentioned before we went on, my grandfather was buried in Arlington, and every summer we'd drive down, visit Grandpa's grave, and we'd stop either on the way back or the way there at Gettysburg, and it just has a very close place to my heart, and I strongly associate it with my grandfather too. So it's such an honor to speak to a club that is both part of Notre Dame and also part of Gettysburg.
Well, I'll kick it back over to Mike for closing remarks, but I'm sure he would agree with me that you're welcome with the Notre Dame Club of Gettysburg anytime. We'll show you around the battlefield and of course, watch a Notre Dame football game with you anytime.
That sounds fantastic.
Mike, you're on mute.
And being with us today, and very enlightening subject, and your background is just overwhelming. And so, and like Pat said, please, anytime you're in the Gettysburg area, just contact any one of us, and we would love to show you around Gettysburg and give you a great tour.
Well, I'd appreciate the insider's tour, and I look forward to doing it sometime soon.
All right.
All right. Thanks, Clayton, and go Irish.
Go Irish.
Go Irish indeed. Thank you.